We are, we are near the end of our journey through the Bible. Well, not through the Bible, through the Old Testament. We decided to journey through the Bible, beginning with the Old Testament, as we call it, or we can call it the Hebrew writings or the Hebrew scriptures, because it is the story of a nation. It is the story of a people coming together and forming a nation, God blessing them. And we've seen that story. I won't rehash it for you for the umpteenth time. But we're near the end of that journey. Just a few more weeks to go, and we'll be done and ready for the Christian writings, the New Testament, before the holidays get here. But today we got to tackle a tough one today. Today we're going to talk about, are you ready for it? The minor prophets. Yeah, all right. Woo! Oh, don't lie. Okay, so no, the minor prophets. What in the world? So this is hard. This is a hard one today for me to present because we have been largely taking a journey through the biblical narrative, which means the stories, because the stories are easier to tell. We have taken some weeks to talk about things like, Psalms and Isaiah and Proverbs and Ecclesiastes and Ezekiel, but largely it's been stories. And today will be one of those that's not, and we're going to cover, there are 12 minor prophets, folks. We're going to cover all of them today. So anyhow, you're like, that's a lot. I know, it's a lot, isn't it? Actually, in the Jewish Bible, I say the Christian Bible, the Christian compilation, because in the Jewish religion or Judaism, they have the same content in their Bible that we have in what we call the Old Testament, but it is a little bit different. For example, theirs is arranged differently than ours, and it's condensed into fewer books, but it's the same material. We have 39 books, they have 24. It's arranged differently as well. But their minor prophets are all put into one book called the Book of the 12. And for us, we keep them all separate as 12 minor prophets. So it's in the back of the Old Testament. I would like to have skipped it, honestly, because I'm afraid today you're going to get whiplash trying to go from one minor prophet and one lesson to another. You're going to have to hang on for dear life today, okay? But because of that, we're going to tackle this. I was almost going to skip it, and I felt like in this particular series, we need to take a Sunday and acknowledge the minor prophets. However, I have asked you all year long to nerd out with me at moments like this. And so because of that, I wanted to help you nerd out with me today. So in the back right now, I'm going to ask you guys to come forward and begin. We're going to pass out little bags of 3 different kinds of Nerds candy for everyone here. We're passing them out to you right now. Get a bag. Seriously. It's like sugar. It's like Baptist liquor, okay, or something. I don't know. But take some of this right now and keep it with you. Enjoy them during the service because you might need it. Now, my advice is make it last the whole sermon, okay? But I know when some of you are hearing the word minor prophets, you're going to be tempted to be like a shot glass, just get down it right now. But try to make it last for the whole, if you can, or find us for more. We have plenty. Save me some for after church. I'm going to need to drown it myself afterwards. Nerds. Why? Because you're going to nerd out with me again today. We're going to talk about the minor prophets on this Sunday. So if you happen to be visiting online, I don't think there's anyone visiting in the room this morning. If you're visiting online, come back another Sunday when we're not talking about the minor prophets, okay? We thought about subtitling this talk, The Bad News Bearers, because we thought it could also apply, but then that was not exactly the right answer either, so we didn't go with that. But anyhow, we are going to jump in. Now, you 3 did a great job passing out the candy. That does not mean you get to eat all the rest yourselves, though, okay? So maybe an extra bag or so is fine. But anyhow, thank you for your help. Are you ready for this? I've warned you. I've given you sugar. Okay, here's the deal. You might feel whiplash today. We're going to drop in and out of various prophets, and then we're going to change topics. Like this guy said this. Oh, that's a good thought. Whoa, we're talking about this now. So get ready for it, okay? First of all, let me put them on the screen for you. These are the 12 minor prophets in the back of our Bible. They are as follows: Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi, okay? So those are the guys. And they all minister during different time periods of Israel. For example, let me just point a few of these out to you. Remember, Israel was once a kingdom that was divided into 2. Then the northern kingdom fell into captivity to the Assyrians. About 150 years later, the southern kingdom and Jerusalem fell to the Babylonians. Okay, so these guys are all over the place. Hosea, Amos, Jonah, Micah all lived before either kingdom fell, before the north fell. 2 of them were living up north, 2 lived in the southern kingdom, but they all lived during the same time in the same era before the fall of the northern kingdom. That would be, then Nahum, Habakkuk, and Zephaniah, they all ministered in after the fall of the northern kingdom, but before the fall of Jerusalem. Joel, it's anyone's guess. There's a lot of speculation. He was early or he was one of the later ones. It's all speculation on Joel. Who knows? Obadiah ministered after the fall of Jerusalem. And then there were 3 prophets. Dave, you got to make those last, man. You only got you got a whole service here. Just kidding. Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. Those last 3 names are the 3 who ministered during the time of what we call the post-captivity period. Now, if you don't know what that is, it's because we haven't gotten to it yet. And we'll only be there for a couple weeks and we'll be done. But after the Jewish people from Jerusalem were taken to captivity, they returned 70 years later to rebuild their land and reoccupy their territory and their cities. And that post-captivity period is Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. Okay? So we're going to look at each of these guys a little bit today. Hang tight. Eat slow. Here goes. Okay. Well, we won't read all of them, so don't get ahead of me here. We're going to stay on the screen for a few minutes. First of all, I'm not going to read any verses from Jonah today. You know why? We spent a whole Sunday on Jonah. Jonah got his own Sunday because Jonah is a story. We've been telling stories mostly during this series. So if you missed that story, you can go back to June 30th on our website. We have the audio version podcast form or the YouTube video version. You can watch the June 30th presentation of Jonah and his story in that book. So we'll skip that today. We'll also skip Nahum. Nahum also speaks to the same people Jonah spoke to, although without the dramatic story. We'll also bypass that narrative today. What else? We will not read Hosea, but I want to tell you about Hosea, okay? You don't even need sugar in your bag of nerds for this one. This is interesting. Hosea, let me tell you about him. Hosea married a prostitute. Yes, you heard that right in church this morning. Hosea, now people were in prostitution in ancient times for lots of reasons, some of the same reasons that would happen today, but also there were other reasons in a different kind of world, especially for women who were widowed or single or used and abused. There's other more sad macro reasons, but people were in prostitution in old days for different reasons. And usually it took a man providing for somebody in that kind of a culture to have a better path forward. Hosea at some point meets a woman who's a prostitute. I don't know how he met her. Don't want to ask. He married her, and she became his wife, and they started a family together. They had kids. They built a home. But sometime down the road, she began to get a desire to go back to her old life, her old lovers, and kind of went back into prostitution for a drawback into that lifestyle. And of course, this did not go well at home. It caused them to divorce. They separated. He basically said, if you don't want to be here, then I'm not going to hold you back, and he let her go. Eventually, her decisions led her to a spot where she ended up in a bunch of debt, a big mess, and eventually became a slave, like a debtor's slave, to the very people that she was caught up with. And Hosea hears about it, and he comes back. And he literally, at a great personal sacrifice financially, he buys her back, pays all her debt, and brings her back home to his house and takes care of her for the rest of her life. It's kind of a weird story. But Hosea, and it's not told like a narrative, really. You have to kind of read between the chapters because Hosea uses that personal testimony to tell a story about God's love for Israel. He was saying, look, God brought us out of slavery as a nation. We were desperate, and he brought us here, and he established and started something with us as a nation. But we have pushed him away and gone after other gods and got tired of him and walked away. And God in his love has let us walk away. But he said, I foresee the day coming when our decisions are going to lead us into a mess and into captivity someday. And when we get there, remember these words, that God's not going to abandon you. He loves you so much, he'll come back and bring you back to himself. It's a picture of God's love. It's a picture, honestly, of several hundred years later when Jesus shows up. It's a beautiful picture of God's love through Jesus Christ in the Christian message. But they weren't talking about that here intentionally. It was just a picture of the love of God through a very weird story, but a beautiful lesson nonetheless. That's Hosea. There's a lot of prophecies in these books about the coming Messiah, Jesus Christ. Zechariah talks about the Sunday, what we celebrate on Palm Sunday every year, when Jesus rode into the Jerusalem on the donkey or on the colt, as they laid down their palm branches before him at the triumphant entry. Zechariah talks about that. We won't read that today. There's several in Joel that are messianic prophecies. I'll read one to you because I think it's worth pointing out. Are you ready for the roller coaster? Let's get into Joel chapter 2 and verse number 28. He says, "Then, after doing all those things, I will pour out my spirit upon all people." Now, what does he mean by all people? Well, he explains. He says, "Your sons and daughters will prophesy or preach. Your old men will dream dreams. Your young men will see visions." So he's explaining what all people means. He says in verse 29, "In those days I will pour out my spirit even on servants, men and women alike." And so what he's saying is this. When God says he's pouring out his spirit, when he's going to spiritually gift and use all people, he means all people. Both your men and your women, both your old and your young, both your wealthy and your poor, or your servants, everybody who wants to come to God and will find his grace, will find his spirit, will find him willing to use them as he gifts them to do so. And I read that today instead of skipping that one because I want to say the church today as a broad category, churches everywhere would do so well to always encourage the spiritual gifts of its people, both the women and the men, both the young and the old, both the wealthier and the non-wealthy. We should never favor any group of people or exclude other people because of who they are or lines that we draw around God's power. Regardless of gender, regardless of age, regardless of socioeconomic status, God will equip and use his people. Anyhow, that's Joel. I did not skip that. Hopefully it won't make us go over today. I got a lot to cover. I want to give you Amos. Amos is, before we don't put it on the screen yet, but in Amos, it's very interesting. Very short book. Amos makes one statement. He actually asks one question that I love so much because it's about the people of Israel and how they were wandering away from God and from God's best practices and then wondering why they didn't feel very close to God. And he asks a question that is such a deep thought that I want us to put it on the screen now. Amos chapter 3 and verse 3, he says, "Can two people walk together without agreeing on the direction?" That's just a great question. And he's applying it spiritually, but I just thought, that might be, God might use that question in someone's life today, even broader than its context. In fact, a lot today might be necessary for somebody broader than its initial context. I wonder if that's a question that someone ought to meditate on this week. People ought to consider that thought. Can two people walk together without agreeing on the direction? That's a great question to ask before you go into business partnership with somebody. Like, I know we both want to make money, but do we both agree on ethics? Do we both agree on systems? Do we both agree on, or is this going to blow up in our face 3 months from now or a year from now? People who are dating ought to remember that every date is a potential mate. And are we aligned? I know we got googly eyes for each other, but do we have the same view of how to handle our finances and what our goals are and how we're going to raise kids and what our moral compass is? Or are we just going to end up in a relationship that's going to inevitably separate as our lives take us different directions? Can two people walk together? Am I following God's ways, or am I wandering a different path? Spiritually, relationally, what a great question to consider. And I wanted to point it out to you today for that reason. Okay, don't get whiplash here. I'm going to step back from that and go into a passage in Obadiah. Let me tell you about it first. Obadiah is a very short book. It's one whole chapter. And Obadiah is writing after Jerusalem is destroyed and both kingdoms have fallen to a people called the Edomites. Who are the Edomites? The Edomites are the descendants of a man named Esau, just like the Israelites were the descendants of a man named Jacob. They were brothers. Esau and Jacob were brothers. And these two brothers would, 1,500 years later, Obadiah's writing, they would become separate nations. They would be in the same vicinity as each other. They were not close in relationship as nations. Sometimes they were even at odds, but they were separate nations living in the same region. And when Israel fell into captivity, when Jerusalem was captured, the Edomites, they didn't handle it very very kindly. They loved it. They enjoyed the destruction of Jerusalem. They laughed. They reveled in it. They gloated. People would run towards the Edomites' land to escape the destruction. They would capture them and hand them over to their enemies, or they'd kill them themselves. They would go back and loot the land that the other people looted after they were done looting it to get some more for themselves. They enjoyed piling on. And Obadiah, when it's all said and done, writes a scathing rebuke of the Edomites. And I'll read a few verses to you so you don't miss the point. Obadiah chapter 1 and verse 10, he says, because of the violence you did to your close relatives in Israel, you will be filled with shame and destroyed forever. When they were invaded, you stood aloof, refusing to help them. Foreign invaders carried off their wealth and cast lots to divide up Jerusalem, but you acted like one of Israel's enemies. You should not have gloated when they exiled your relatives to distant lands. You should not have rejoiced when the people of Judah suffered such misfortune. You should not have spoken arrogantly in that terrible time of trouble. You should not have plundered the land of Israel when they were suffering such calamity. You should not have gloated over their destruction when they were suffering such calamity. You should not have seized their wealth when they were suffering such calamity. You should not have stood at the crossroads, killing those who tried to escape. You should not have captured the survivors and handed them over in their terrible time of trouble. And he says to the Edomites something that I think is a principle throughout the Bible. Proverbs has a verse like this. The Christian writings talk about this in Galatians. And that is this: it does not please God when we enjoy the demise of somebody else. And Obadiah is saying, listen, yes, Israel has wrecked itself through its own bad decisions. And yes, it's brought its own suffering upon itself through its own choices. But don't you sit back and gloat at someone else's misfortune. Shame on you. And boy, we should all remember that. Because it's so easy for humans to sit there and say, ooh, did you hear about so-and-so? With a grin in the corner of our mouth. Did you hear what happened to them? Well, let me tell you. Well, you should, that's what happens. That's how it goes, Maybe they're your enemy. Maybe they're your ops, Maybe they're somebody who you don't get along with and you're tempted to say, well, I don't care. But we should never gloat. We should never pile on. We should never enjoy it or take advantage of it for our own gain. And if we are tempted to do that, it's a red flag for our own hearts. Our reaction ought to be to say when someone's suffering, even if they're an enemy, even if there's someone you don't like, even if someone you don't agree with, our reaction ought to be to say, I'm so sad to see that. I wish that wasn't happening. Can I even help? But if not, I'm so sorry to see that. And if we have any of this attitude that the Edomites had when other people suffer, there ought to be a check in ourselves where God says, I'm watching you, and I'll deal with you next. It's good. Moving on. Don't get whiplash. Here we go. Step back out and step back in. 3 books we're going to cover. Habakkuk, Zephaniah, and Zechariah all talk about a very cool idea that we find in the whole Bible, not just the New Testament, and that is that God cares about how we treat other people. Sometimes we are tempted to think that the God of the New Testament doesn't feel very much like the God of the Old Testament. You know what I'm saying? Like, are they the same God? I don't know. But that's because we misunderstand the purposes of these 2 books, these 2 collections of books. What we call the Old Testament is the Hebrew scriptures or the Hebrew writings. And the Christian writings or the Christian scriptures. Those deal with the story of Jesus saving the whole world. It's the individual. Where the Old Testament is the story of a nation and the nation being formed and the nation being, it's a barbaric world. It's a brutal world. And if you misunderstand the purpose and the authorship and what the authors were trying to convey through their own lens, you'll misunderstand the heart of God. But even in the Old Testament, in the Hebrew writings, God was very progressive for his time and how he wanted people to treat each other. And his message over and over again in those writings was treat people right. He would say over and over, put me first, have no other gods before me, don't worship other gods, follow me, follow my best practices, and in doing so, I'll teach you how to live and I'll teach you to treat people right. This is not a New Testament Jesus idea, it's a God idea forever. And here's a few examples of that. Are you ready? Let's begin with Habakkuk. Habakkuk 2, verse 9. What sorrow awaits you who build big houses with money gained dishonestly? unethically or took advantage of other people. You believe your wealth will buy security, putting your family's nest beyond the reach of danger. But by the murders you committed, you have shamed your name and forfeited your lives. The very stones in the walls cry out against you, and the beams in the ceilings echo the complaint. He says, just like Edgar Allan Poe's The Fall of the House of Usher is going to come crashing down on you one day, because you did it at the expense of other people. God cares about how we treat people. Without reading all of them, I'm just going to put a reference on the screen for you right now. It's Zephaniah chapter 3, 1 through 5. To save some time, I won't read it. Go home and read it for yourself if you want to. What it basically tells us is that he's saying there's people in leadership who are abusing others, politicians and political leaders, judges and people in the judicial system, prophets and priests who are using their authority to enrich themselves and hurt other people. He dresses them down. Check it out. And then one more, we skipped Zechariah earlier, so I'm going to go back to Zechariah now. In Zechariah 7 and verse 8, he says, then this message came to Zechariah from the Lord. This is what the Lord of heaven's army says. Ready? Judge fairly and show mercy and kindness to one another. Wouldn't the world be better if people just did that? When we have to make a judgment, to judge fairly. And when we do, to choose to show mercy and kindness to one another. Wow. He goes on in verse number 10 and says, do not oppress widows, orphans, foreigners, and the poor. Why? Because they're in helpless situations. They're in desperate straits. Don't take advantage of the unfortunate or the weak. And do not scheme against each other. That'd make the world a better place right there. God cares about how we treat each other. I have 3 prophets to go. We got through 9 just now. Can you believe that? 3 to go. But the last one's going to be a doozy, so hang tight. But this one, I want to talk about Haggai for a minute. Haggai is one of those prophets that I told you about in the post-captivity. Remember the post-captivity? That's when the Israelites return from exile and rebuild their land. They rebuild Jerusalem. Guess what they did when they came home? They began to build their own houses. They began to build their own vineyards. And they kept neglecting to rebuild the temple. And Haggai's message was very simple. Look, God brought you all out of slavery back in the day and brought you here and established a worship system to keep your relationship close to him. You've abandoned God along the way, and in doing so, abandoned best practices along the way, and found yourself wrecked and ruined in your own life choices along the way. And God has brought you out of slavery, brought you back home, and now you're going to neglect him once again? You need to rebuild the temple, because the temple is your local place of worship. It's your place where you come together and make spiritual priority as well as financial priority or personal property priorities in your life. Don't forget the spiritual part of your life. Rebuild the temple. And so he talks about it in Haggai chapter 1, beginning with verse 2. This is what the Lord of heaven's army says. The people are saying the time has not yet come to rebuild the house of the Lord. Then the Lord sent this message through the prophet Haggai. Why are you living in luxurious houses while my house lies in ruins? This is what the Lord of heaven's army says. Look at what's happening to you. You have planted much, but harvest little. You eat, but are not satisfied. You drink, but are still thirsty. You put on clothes, but cannot keep warm. Your wages disappear as though you were putting them in pockets filled with holes. Sound familiar? This is what the Lord of heaven's army says. Look at what's happening to you. Now go up into the hills, bring down timber, and rebuild my house. Then I will take pleasure in it and be honored, says the Lord. You hoped for rich harvests, but they were poor. And when you brought your harvest home, I blew it away. Why? Because my house lies in ruins, says the Lord of heaven's armies, while all of you are busy building your own fine houses. So he says, look, I'm glad you're building your property, but don't neglect your spiritual life. That's good for all of us to remember, that as we're pursuing, and we all have a plan to get better, but are we holistic? Is it just like physical health, mental health? Where's our spiritual input? And you're here on a Sunday, that's wonderful. Let's make sure that we're prioritizing all the parts of our lives and not just the parts that might press on us personally the most. And don't neglect the Lord in your journey. Moving on to the last book of the Old Testament. Not the last one we're going to talk about today. We have one more. But the last book in our Old Testament in order is the book of Malachi. And I want to tell you right now, For the nerds, by the way, do you have any candy left still? Or are they all gone? A little bit? Okay. Malachi, for the nerds, is one of the most misunderstood. Actually, most of these books are misunderstood. We have no idea of the history going on back then, so we just apply. Most of that, we apply the Old Testament, and that's fine. I think it's great to pull old lessons and apply them to new things, but we are often oblivious of the actual context, and though we make some really weird analogies sometimes. But that can be true for most of it, but Malachi is maybe the most abused book of them all. Because Malachi was written in a time when, in the decades that followed the return from captivity, when there was 2 temples built in the land of Israel, one up in Samaria in Mount Gerizim, one in Jerusalem. There was competing power for the central authority of where Israel's foundation would be, house of David versus house of Israel. There was prophetic lines and covenant, and there's all sorts of there was so much politics. There were literal people in history who are doing things to stab each other in the back that Malachi is writing about, that if we knew the story, and I could talk about it with you because I've studied it, but it would make sense why he said what he said, but we don't even know. It's a very complicated book, and we could take an hour trying to explain its content. We will not do that. But I will say there's one passage that I wanted to point out because it reminded me of something we discussed a few weeks ago. Let's see if anyone else catches it. In Malachi 2:17, he says, "You have wearied the Lord with your words." How have we wearied him, you ask? Time out. That's a common tactic of Malachi's writing style. He often would make an outlandish statement and follow up with a question from the audience, allegedly, and then answer the question that he posited. How have we wearied the Lord, you ask? You have wearied him by saying that all who do evil are good in the Lord's sight, and he is pleased with them. You have wearied him by asking, where is the God of justice? Now, if that sounds at all familiar, and maybe it doesn't, and I don't want to ask because I'll get depressed. It's because that's exactly what Ezekiel was addressing in our Ezekiel lesson a few weeks ago when he was talking about the sour grapes mindset. People saying God is not good and God is not just because of the things that have happened. And Malachi's like, guys, God brought you out of captivity despite your own recklessness and brought you back home, and he's rebuilding your lives. You're going to overlook all his goodness to see it's not fair. Those bad people are prospering. Those good people are suffering. God's not just. It's a mindset issue. It's an outlook issue on life, and there's got to be a more holistic way to see God and yourselves than that. But we won't spend any more time there because we discussed that a few weeks ago with Ezekiel. Which brings me to our last prophet. 11 down, 1 to go. Okay, don't get excited now. One more to go today, and we're done. And you can say, I got a church service where we talk about the 12 minor prophets. And all your friends will be like, my deepest sympathies to you. But anyhow, the last one, the one I've not mentioned yet, does anybody who was not here last hour remember? Looking at Ben and Carolyn, they're like, I know the answer to this. Does anybody know, or Nathan, does anybody else know which prophet I've not mentioned yet that's the last of the 12? This always depresses me. Oh, I didn't mention him yet, so it's not me that you don't know. It's just the Bible. Come on, nerds. Okay, I'm just kidding. The last one is Micah. And Micah is my favorite of the minor prophets. You were that close, weren't you, Griffin? You were right on the verge of it. That's good. Micah is my favorite. Jonah should be because it's a cool story, but I love Micah for his content. We're going to look at 3 things, 3 passages Micah points out, and then we're going to be done today. So, are you ready? I love Micah. Micah chapter 6, we'll start there. Micah 6, verse 6. He says, what can we bring to the Lord? Should we bring him burnt offerings? Should we bow before God Most High with offerings of yearling calves? Should we offer him thousands of rams and 10,000 rivers of olive oil? Should we sacrifice our firstborn children to pay for our sin? I'm going to talk about this right here for a minute. He is asking the question that people have asked in religion forever. Religions have historically said, is God angry at us, and that's why the world is got some bad stuff that happens? And how do we make the gods or the deities happy with us? Do we do it by harming ourselves, by cutting ourselves, by killing our kids, by spending all of our money in like the olive oil and pouring it all out, or by killing our animals and our livestock in some kind of a sacrifice to appease the gods? And religions have often wondered about God through this lens right here. And even when you read the Old Testament, you'll see so much animal sacrifice. I know some of us, depending on your proclivities towards just accepting the Bible holistically versus struggling with, I don't know about that. Some people are like, why are there animal sacrifices in the Bible? And I get that tension. I get it. Some people speculate it's because that the ancient religions of the world all did animal sacrifices, and the early Jewish people did the same in the worship of their version of God. Others say, no, this was God very intentionally for specific macro reasons. I don't care to argue that with anybody. It's messy, if we're honest. But here's the point. Even through the Old Testament, people began to raise a question like, is this really what God wants? David, who offered sacrifices, once said in the Psalms, he says, this isn't what impresses God. And he says what does. We'll see that in a minute here. Later, Isaiah the prophet said, you think God's impressed with your sacrifices? You think God wants you to sacrifice other things or harm yourself financially or kill somebody or something to make him happy and appease him? Like God gets off on that? No. And then he explains what God does care about. And both David and Isaiah and now Micah make the same conversation. Does God want those things to make him happy? And the answer is no. Verse 8, know, O people. The Lord has told you what is good, and this is what he requires of you. Ready? This is important. When he says this is what God requires of you, David kind of mentions this, Isaiah mentions this, Micah puts an exclamation point on the whole idea. It's so simple. This is what he requires of you, to do what is right, and to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. That's a great formula for life. To do what is right. Just do what's right. To love mercy, that means love to be merciful to other people and to walk humbly, not arrogantly, but humbly in this life with our God. That's good stuff right there. We're going to come back to that at the very end before we dismiss in prayer, before we close in prayer. But I want to take you to another passage of Micah that I love. Before we turn to it, I want to tell you the context. Micah is foreseeing that one day the nation will be taken into captivity because of their own bad decisions. And Micah is trying to tell them, when that day comes, I'm writing this down so you'll remember what I'm saying. And here's what I'm saying. When our nation is down, don't feel like it has to be final, that God can bring us back, that we can go through a bad season because of our own bad decisions, and we can learn our lesson and recover and come back stronger than ever. We can, we may not, but we can. And he uses the analogy of a comeback by applying it not just to a nation, but to a person, that a person in life can go along the way and a person can mess up a relationship, mess up a career, mess up their life, and they can just stumble and fall over their own 2 feet, figuratively speaking, but they can handle that failure the right way, get back up and find a way to go forward. And he's using this illustration for the nation, but he makes it personal for the individual. And he applies it to himself. In Micah chapter 7 and verse 7. He says, as for me, I look to the Lord for help. I wait confidently for God to save me, and my God will certainly hear me. I love this next verse. Are you ready? He says, do not gloat over me, my enemies. In other words, that was what we saw in Obadiah earlier. They were like gloating over ooh, look who fell. And he's saying on a personal level, hey, when I stumble, do not gloat over me. This is good. For though I fall, I will rise again. Now, I'm going to tee into that in a minute here, but I love the moxie in there. I love the chutzpah of that right there. I love the idea of saying, hey, I may have fallen and that stinks, but I will rise again. Some of us need that in our lives. We need a little bit of that to us. Though I fall, I will rise again. Though I sit in darkness, the Lord will be my light. I will be patient as the Lord punishes me, for I have sinned against him. But after that, he will take up my case and give me justice for all I have suffered from my enemies. The Lord will bring me into the light, and I will see his righteousness. And he's saying, listen, no matter who you are, where you are, just because there's always a possibility for a comeback. Just because you're knocked down doesn't mean you're knocked out. Just because you lose a battle, it means you have to lose the war. Just because you lose a round doesn't mean you have to lose the fight. As Mick told Rocky Balboa, I didn't hear no bell. I didn't hear no bell. Hey, Though I fall, I will rise again. I'm telling you, we need a little bit of that in us because all of us, and he's talking about a nation, but he talks about an individual. We will all stumble. We will all misstep. We will all mess up sometimes. And the temptation is to always say, I'm not cut out for this. I tried. I just can't. I'm just going to not try anymore. But the best people look at themselves and say, okay, what do I need to learn from this? What consequences do I need to accept from the failures? And then how do I go forward? How do I fail forward? That's good for a person. That's good for a company. That's good for a nation. That's good for anybody. How do we learn from this and go forward? Though I fall, I will rise again. Is it time for someone here? The thing you needed to hear this morning at church is you fell. Fail forward. Rise again. Where do we go from here? I love that moxie of that verse right there. That's so good. Anyhow, a few verses later, Micah says one more thing that I think is so beautiful. I want us to see it together. Micah 7:18, he says, where is another God like you, who pardons the guilt of the remnant, overlooking the sins of his special people? You will not stay angry with your people forever because you delight in showing unfailing love. I love that. You delight in showing unfailing love. You know, some of your older English translations might say you delight in mercy or showing mercy. And that's fine. Mercy, they're saying the same thing. Unfailing love is a little more accurate of a translated phrase, but they're both saying something good. But here's the idea. The idea of showing mercy or unfailing love means someone blew it. If there's a need for mercy, it's because someone messed up, right? The idea of God showing unfailing love means this, that we failed, but God's love never fails. And so when he says God delights in showing unfailing love, what does he mean? Not that God delights in people messing up. Like, oh, good, you messed up. Oh, that must have hurt. Woo! No, that's not what God's saying. He doesn't enjoy our faults, our failures, our bruised knees and our skinned fingers when we fall. That's not what he's saying. What God is saying is though a failure stinks and though messing up is bad and though bad choices lead to bad outcomes, God says there is a silver lining to that cloud. And the silver lining is I get the chance to show unfailing love or mercy, and I delight in that. What does that mean? It's simple. Think about it this way. If someone is always awesome, it's not hard to love them. It's not even impressive that you love someone who's awesome, someone who's always perfect. That's why it's, so hard to love, to not love me because I'm so perfect all the time that it's hard not to just love me, right? Amen. No amens there? I expected some hand waving right there. Amen, preacher. That's good. He's perfect. But no, if your spouse is perfect, like mine is, if your family member is perfect, if you got kids that never disappoint you, parents that always make you happy, friends who never let you down, and you're like, I love you guys. I love you guys. You're like, of course you love us. We're perfect. We're awesome. The idea is that it's when somebody disappoints you. Are you with me? When someone lets you down, when someone blows it, that you have the chance to show how real our love is. Or as the Bee Gees saying, how deep is your love? Right? That's your chance. When they mess up and they're like, why would you possibly still want to be around me? Why do you love me still? It's like, because I do. It's in the mistakes that your spouse makes, that your kids disappoint, that your parents frustrate, that your friends hurt your feelings, that you have a chance to say, let me show you how much I care about you. And God says, I don't love it when you fall, but I love the chance that your failures bring me a silver lining, to give me a chance to show you that if you thought you all were perfect and I'm like, hey, I love you. Well, of course you do, God. I mean, I'm amazing. But when you're feeling down and dirty and low, and God says, I love you. You're like, God, why do you love me? God said, because I do. And I delight in the chance to show you how much. That's a beautiful message. He delights in mercy. He delights in showing unfailing love. And that's it. There is the old minor prophets. You survived. Did your nerds survive with you, or are they all gone? They didn't survive? I didn't make it past Malachi right there, Okay. We're almost done with the series. We have 4 weeks to go. Here's what's left. The next 4 weeks, we have 3 stories to tell. One of them will take 2 weeks. That's why that'll take 4. 3 stories to come. 2 of the 3 stories will involve people coming back from the captivity in Babylon to reestablish themselves in Jerusalem, rebuild the city, rebuild the walls, rebuild the temple. It's pretty interesting stuff going on there. You don't want to miss that. But the last one we're going to tell is in a land far away, and it's so epic, it'll take 2 weeks to tell, and it's a great way to end our Old Testament story. And then we'll be done. But for today, the minor prophets. I hope that you got some information, but not just information. I hope you got some things that stood out to you. I hope something spoke to you in the message. Maybe, I don't know what it could be. Maybe it was the idea that God's Spirit is for all people and his gifts are for all people, women and men, young and old, rich and poor, right? Everybody. Who wants to find God's use? God uses people. Maybe the question you need to wrestle down in some part of your life, can 2 people walk together without agreeing on the direction? Maybe it's the idea of not questioning God's justice in a world that doesn't always seem fair. Maybe it's how we treat people. Maybe it's not gloating over the demise of others and instead feeling bad, even when they're bad people, that you hate to see people hurt. Maybe it's you should go marry a prostitute. No, it's not that. It's not that. Do not do that's not the takeaway from today's sermon. Do not do that. Maybe it's prioritizing the care of your spiritual life and the importance of even the places of worship in the middle of our faith journey. Maybe it's that when you get knocked down, you're not knocked out, and when you fall, you rise again. Get some chutzpah about yourself and get back up and learn. Maybe it's the fact that God delights in showing unfailing love, and that's what you need to know today. He loves you. I don't know. But I'll offer you one more that we've already seen as a reminder as we close this out. What Micah said God requires, and it's a simple 3 short statements put together. It goes like this. Do right. Love mercy. Walk humbly. That's good stuff. Do right means do the right thing. So what happens when I don't do the right thing and I make a mistake? Then then get back up and rise again and give it another go and learn the lessons from it, right? But then do right. That's a journey in itself right there. Some people never try. Some people stop trying. Just do what's right. We'd be so much better if people just said, what is the right thing to do? And then as we do that, if we can add a layer, and that means love mercy. What does love mercy mean? It means that when other people around you don't do what's right, when they don't do what's right in your eyes, when they don't do what's right towards you, and you're tempted to not be kind about it, that you do what's right, and when they don't do what's right, you choose to love mercy, the same way that God chooses to love the chance to show that he cares about imperfect people and delights in showing it to us. Do right. If we would do right and love mercy, we'd be so far ahead. But then the other layer is this. Don't get cocky. Don't get arrogant. We don't need more arrogant religious people in the world. But as you do what's right, and as you love mercy, you stay humble. And you walk humbly. You know that by the grace of God, anything can happen on any given day. And you walk humbly with your God. And if we could do that, we could take that mantra. Maybe, just maybe, the world would be a better place. Imagine the world full of people that did what's right and loved mercy for others and walked humbly. Imagine the church's impact if people who call themselves Jesus followers lived in such a way in our culture that we did what was right and we loved mercy and we walked humbly. I just think, I don't know, it'd be a pretty cool thing. Now, I don't know if anything helped you today, but I hope it wasn't just information, because I don't want you just to go home and be a bunch of Bible nerds. I want something in the scriptures to inform how we live. And whatever God says to you, let's hear his voice. Heavenly Father,